The morning mist clung to the scarred landscape like a shroud, obscuring the jagged silhouette of Vimy Ridge from the Canadian trenches below. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Currie peered through his field glasses at the seemingly impregnable German. The fortress that had claimed thousands of Allied lives since 1914, the ridge stretching 7 miles across the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France, has become a symbol of German invincibility on the Western Front. For 2.5 years, the ridge had withstood every assault thrown against it. French forces had bled themselves white in repeated attempts to take the heights in 1915, losing over 150,000 men in the process. The British had fared no better. Their attacks of 1916 resulting in nothing but more names etched into stone memorials. The Germans had transformed the ridge into a masterpiece of defensive engineering, with deep bunkers, interlocking, machine gun nests, and miles of barbed wire, creating what seemed an insurmountable obstacle. But April of 1917 would be different. For the first time in the war, all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps would fight together under unified command. General Julian Byng, the British commander of the Canadian Corps, had spent months planning an assault that would either break the deadlock or add Canadian names to the growing list of failed attempts. The Canadians had arrived at Vimy with a reputation already forged in blood. At Ypres, they had held the line against the first German gas attacks. At the Somme, they had proven their mettle in the most brutal fighting the war had yet seen. Now, as they prepared for what many believed would be their greatest test, the men of the Canadian Corps carried with them not just the hopes of their nation, but the weight of history itself, as referenced in military historian Pierre Berton's comprehensive analysis. The Canadian approach to Vimy would differ fundamentally from previous Allied attempts. Where others had relied on brute force and overwhelming numbers, the Canadians would employ meticulous planning, innovative tactics, and unprecedented cooperation between infantry, artillery, and engineers. The ridge itself dominated the surrounding countryside, its chalky slopes rising 145 feet above the Douai plain. From its crest, German observers could direct artillery fire across miles of Allied territory, making any movement behind Canadian lines a deadly gamble. The German Fourth Army had constructed 3 defensive lines along the ridge, each more formidable than the last. The forward positions bristled with machine guns and trench mortar, while the rear areas contained massive artillery pieces capable of pulverizing any attacking force. Major General Arthur Currie, commanding the 1st Canadian Division, understood that success would require more than courage. His men would need to know every inch of the battlefield, every German position, every potential obstacle. In the weeks leading up to the assault, Canadian engineers constructed a detailed replica of the ridge behind their lines, allowing every soldier to rehearse his role in the coming battle. The stakes could not have been higher. Failure would mean not just another tactical defeat, but the potential destruction of the Canadian Corps as an effective fighting force. Success, however, would prove to the world that the young Dominion of Canada had come of age as a military power, capable of achieving what the great European armies could not. The Canadian preparation for Vimy Ridge represented a revolution in military planning and execution. Unlike the hasty, ill-conceived attacks that had characterized much of the Western Front fighting, the Canadian assault would be built upon months of careful reconnaissance, innovative training, and technological advancement. Andrew McNaughton, the Canadian Corps' chief artillery officer, orchestrated what would become the most sophisticated artillery barrage in military history up to that point. Over 980 artillery pieces, including massive siege guns borrowed from the British, were positioned along the Canadian front. McNaughton's revolutionary creeping barrage technique would see artillery fire advance ahead of the infantry at a predetermined pace, providing continuous support while avoiding the friendly fire incidents that had plagued previous attacks. The artillery preparation began on March 20th, 1917, with what the Germans would later call the Week of Suffering. Canadian gunners systematically destroyed German wire entanglements, collapsed trenches, and silenced enemy batteries. Counter-battery fire became an art form under McNaughton's direction, with Canadian guns hunting down and destroying German artillery pieces with unprecedented accuracy. Meanwhile, Infantry underwent training unlike anything seen before in the war. Every soldier, from private to colonel, studied detailed maps of the German positions. Sand tables and mock-ups allowed men to memorize the terrain they would cross, while specialized training prepared them for the unique challenges of trench warfare. The Canadians practiced advancing behind a creeping barrage, timing their movements to stay within the protective envelope of their own artillery fire. Innovation extended beyond traditional military tactics. Canadian engineers, many of whom had been miners in civilian life, began an ambitious tunneling operation beneath the German lines. Working in shifts around the clock, they excavated miles of tunnels, some large enough to accommodate entire companies of men. These subterranean highways would allow Canadian forces to approach the German lines undetected, merging directly into the enemy trenches when the assault began. The tunnel system also served another purpose: the placement of massive mines beneath key German positions. Tons of explosives were carefully positioned under machine gun nests and command posts, ready to be detonated at the moment of attack. The psychological effect on the Germans was significant, as they could hear the constant sounds of digging beneath their feet but were powerless to stop it. Intelligence gathering reached new levels of sophistication. Canadian observers, using advanced photography and surveying techniques, mapped every German position with mathematical precision. Prisoner interrogations provided valuable insights into German morale and defensive plans. Even the timing of the attack was chosen with scientific precision, taking into account wind patterns, visibility, and the German duty schedule, as detailed in the official Canadian military records. The logistical preparation was equally impressive. Hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment were stockpiled. Field hospitals were established, and evacuation routes planned. Communication networks were laid out with redundant systems to ensure orders could be transmitted even under the heaviest bombardment. The Canadian Corps had been transformed from a collection of individual units into a unified fighting machine. The 1st Division under Major General Arthur Currie would assault the northern section of the ridge. 2nd Division, led by Major General Henry Burstall, would attack the center. The 3rd Division, commanded by Major General Louis Lipsett, would strike the southern positions, while the 4th Division, under Major General David Watson, would tackle the heavily fortified village of Thelis. By early April, everything was in place. The Canadian Corps had become a weapon of unprecedented precision and power, ready to test itself against the most formidable defensive position on the Western Front. Easter Monday, April 9, 1917, dawned cold and gray across the scarred landscape of northern France. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, the largest artillery barrage in Canadian military history erupted along the Vimy front. The earth shook as nearly 1,000 guns opened fire simultaneously, their thunderous roar audible 20 miles away. The great offensive had begun. In the Canadian trenches, soldiers huddled against the overwhelming noise, their faces blackened with mud and determination. Private William Milne of the 16th Battalion clutched his rifle and checked his equipment one final time. Like thousands of his comrades, he had rehearsed this moment countless times. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of what lay ahead. The artillery barrage was unlike anything the Germans had experienced. The Canadian guns, firing with clockwork precision, systematically destroyed defensive positions, while creating a steel curtain that advanced inexorably toward the German rear lines. The innovative creeping barrage technique moved forward at exactly 100 yards every 3 minutes, forcing the attacking infantry to maintain perfect timing to stay within its protective envelope. At 0 hour, the first wave of Canadian infantry went over the top. The 1st Division, attacking on the left flank, advanced through the morning mist with bayonets fixed and determination etched on their faces. Major General Arthur Currie's meticulous planning immediately paid dividends as his men found the German wire already cut by the preliminary bombardment and many of the forward positions abandoned or destroyed. The 2nd Division, advancing up the center of the ridge, encountered fiercer resistance. German machine gunners emerging from deep bunkers that had survived the bombardment poured deadly fire into the advancing Canadians. But the weeks of training showed their value as small units maneuvered around strong points while others maintained frontal pressure. The combination of rifle fire, grenades, and individual initiative gradually overwhelmed the German defenders. On the right flank, the 3rd Division faced perhaps the most challenging assignment. The German positions here were particularly well constructed, with interlocking fields of fire that had stopped previous attacks cold. Major General Louis Lipsitz's men advanced with textbook precision, using shell craters for cover and maintaining communication with supporting artillery. When they encountered a particularly stubborn machine gun nest, pre-positioned Canadian snipers eliminated the crews with surgical precision. The 4th Division's assault on the village of Thielis represented the most ambitious objective of the day. The settlement had been transformed into a fortress, with every building converted into a strong point and the surrounding area sown with mines and obstacles. Major General David Watson's men approached the village using the underground tunnels that had been months in the making, emerging directly into the German trenches and creating chaos in the enemy ranks, as chronicled in the Toronto Globe's detailed war correspondence. The coordination between different arms of the Canadian Corps reached unprecedented levels. When infantry encountered obstacles, artillery observers immediately called down accurate fire. Engineers moved forward with the assault, troops clearing obstacles and establishing communication lines. Medical personnel, positioned in advanced aid stations, evacuated wounded men with remarkable efficiency. The German defenders, commanded by General Friedrich von Lossberg, had prepared for another frontal assault similar to the failed French and British attacks. They were completely unprepared for the sophisticated combined arms approach employed by the Canadians. The creeping barrage prevented reinforcements from reaching the forward positions, while the precise timing of the infantry advance gave the defenders no opportunity to reorganize. By noon, Canadian troops had penetrated deeper into the German lines than any previous Allied attack. The 1st and 2nd Divisions had secured their initial objectives and were pushing toward the crest of the ridge. The 3rd Division had broken through the intermediate line and was advancing on the village of Thielis alongside the 4th Division. The success of the morning phase exceeded even the most optimistic Canadian expectations. For the first time since the war began, a major German defensive position was crumbling under sustained pressure. The impossible ridge was beginning to fall. By mid-afternoon on April 9th, the Canadian assault had achieved what many military experts had deemed impossible. The German defensive lines, which had withstood every previous attack, were collapsing under the sustained pressure of the Canadian Corps' methodical advance. The ridge that had claimed so many Allied lives was finally within grasp. The 1st Division, having secured its initial objectives ahead of schedule, pressed forward toward the crest of the ridge. Major General Arthur Curry's men advanced with the confidence of soldiers who had found their plan working perfectly. German resistance, while still fierce in pockets, lacked the coordination that had made previous defenses so effective. The creeping barrage had disrupted communications between German units, leaving many strong points isolated and vulnerable. Private John Pattison of the 50th Battalion exemplified the individual heroism that characterized the Canadian advance. When his company encountered a particularly stubborn German machine gun position, Pattison single-handedly charged the nest, eliminating the crew with grenades and rifle fire. His actions, which would later earn him the Victoria Cross, opened a crucial gap in the German line that allowed his battalion to continue its advance. The 2nd Division faced its most challenging moment as it approached the intermediate German line. Here, the defenders had regrouped and were putting up determined resistance. Captain Thane McDowell of the 38th Battalion found himself leading a small group of men against a heavily fortified German position. Using tactics learned in the months of preparation, McDowell's men systematically reduced the strong point, capturing the T-7 German soldiers and 2 machine guns in the process. The 3rd Division's advance toward Thielis village had become a race against time. German artillery, firing from positions beyond the ridge, was beginning to find the range of the Canadian advance. Major General Louis Lipsett's men pressed forward through increasingly heavy fire, using the rubble of destroyed buildings for cover. The village, which had been transformed into a fortress, was being systematically cleared building by building. The 4th Division faced perhaps the greatest challenge of the day. The northern section of the ridge, including the heavily fortified Pimple position, represented the strongest point of the German defense. Major General David Watson's men had made good progress throughout the morning, but the approach to the final German line would test their resolve to the limit. As documented in the Canadian Military Archives, coordination between artillery and infantry reached its peak during the afternoon advance. When Canadian troops encountered unexpected resistance, artillery observers immediately adjusted fire to suppress German positions. The flexibility of the artillery support, combined with the aggressive tactics of the infantry, created a synergy that the Germans found impossible to counter. German General Friedrich von Lossberg, commanding the Fourth Army, watched his carefully constructed defenses crumble with growing alarm. The Canadian attack displayed a level of sophistication that exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The combination of overwhelming artillery support, innovative tactics, and individual soldier initiative was proving unstoppable. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the impossible was becoming reality. Canadian troops had reached the crest of Vimy Ridge at several points. The German defenders were beginning to withdraw to their final defensive line. The maple leaf flag was planted on the highest point of the ridge by men of the 1st Division, a symbolic moment that would echo through Canadian history. The capture of Thielis village fell to the combined efforts of the 3rd and 4th Divisions. The systematic clearing of the settlement, house by house and bunker by bunker, demonstrated the thorough training that had characterized the Canadian preparation. By evening, the village was in Canadian hands, and the German intermediate line had been completely breached as darkness fell on April 9th. The Canadian corps had achieved what had seemed impossible just hours before. The ridge that had defied French and British attacks for over 2 years was firmly in Canadian hands. The cost had been significant, over 3,000 Canadian casualties. But the strategic and psychological impact of the victory was immeasurable. The second day of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, April 10th, 1917, would complete the transformation of what had seemed an impossible dream into triumphant reality. As dawn broke over the captured positions, Canadian troops prepared for the final push that would secure the entire ridge and establish one of the most decisive victories of the Great War. The German defenders, reeling from the previous days' catastrophic losses, had fallen back to their final defensive line. General Friedrich von Lossberg ordered a desperate counterattack, hoping to regain some of the lost ground before the Canadians could consolidate their positions. German reserves, hurriedly brought forward from rear areas, launched a series of determined but ultimately futile assaults against the Canadian positions. The 4th Division faced the most challenging task of the final phase, the capture of the Pimple, a heavily fortified position at the northern end of the ridge. This strongpoint, defended by elements of the Bavarian Reserve Regiment, had been prepared for months and represented the last major German position on the ridge. Major General David Watson's men, supported by concentrated artillery fire, began their assault at dawn. The attack on the Pimple demonstrated the evolution of Canadian tactics throughout the battle, rather than the frontal assaults that had characterized earlier phases of the war. The Canadians employed infiltration tactics, small unit maneuvers, and combined arms coordination. Sections of men moved forward under cover of artillery fire, systematically reducing German positions while maintaining pressure across the entire front. Captain Christopher Ocelli of the 52nd Battalion led one of the most crucial actions of the day. When his company encountered a series of German machine gun nests defending the approach to the Pimple, Ocelli organized a flanking movement that eliminated the positions and opened the way for the main assault. His leadership and tactical skill exemplified the quality of junior officers that had been developed through the Canadian training program. The 1st Division, having secured the main crest of the ridge, turned its attention to consolidating the captured positions. Major General Arthur Curry's men worked frantically to reverse the German trenches, establish communication lines, and prepare for the inevitable counterattacks. The efficiency with which these tasks were accomplished reflected the thorough preparation that had characterized the entire Canadian operation. As reported in the Ottawa Citizen's War Correspondence, the German resistance began to crumble under the sustained pressure of the Canadian advance. Units that had fought tenaciously 4 days found themselves isolated and overwhelmed. The psychological impact of losing the impregnable ridge was devastating to German morale, while the Canadians fought with the confidence of men who had achieved the impossible. The final assault on the Pimple began at 6 o'clock in the morning of April 10th. 4th Division, supported by concentrated artillery fire and aided by the cover of early morning mist, advanced up the slopes with methodical precision. German defenders, many of whom had not slept for 36 hours, found themselves facing fresh Canadian troops who had been held in reserve for this crucial moment. The capture of the Pimple was completed by noon, with the last German defenders either killed, captured, or forced to retreat. The entire Vimy Ridge was now in Canadian hands. The strategic situation on the Western Front had been fundamentally altered. The German army had lost one of its most important defensive positions, while the Canadian corps had demonstrated that well-planned, properly executed operations could achieve decisive results even in the deadlock of trench warfare. By the afternoon of April 10th, the Battle of Vimy Ridge was effectively over. German forces had withdrawn to defensive positions several miles to the east, abandoning not only the ridge but also the extensive tunnel systems and fortifications that had taken years to construct. The Canadian corps had achieved complete victory, capturing more ground, more prisoners, and more equipment than any previous Allied operation on the Western Front. The cost of victory had been significant, but not catastrophic. Canadian casualties totaled approximately 10,000 men, with over 3,000 killed and 7,000 wounded. While these losses were grievous, they were far less than the casualties suffered by French and British forces in their failed attempts to take the ridge. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Vimy Ridge resonated far beyond the captured trenches and shattered German positions. As Canadian troops consolidated their hold on the ridge throughout April 11th and 12th, the implications of their victory began to ripple through the Allied command structure, the German High Command, and the homes of a young nation that had just announced its arrival on the world stage, General Julian Byng. The British commander of the Canadian Corps surveyed the captured positions with a mixture of pride and amazement. The ridge that had defied every previous assault lay firmly in Canadian hands, its German defenders either captured, killed, or withdrawn to positions miles to the east. The success exceeded even Byng's most optimistic projections, and he immediately recognized that the victory presented more than just a tactical success. It was a demonstration of Canadian military capability that would reshape how the Dominion was viewed by allies and enemies alike. The strategic impact of the victory was immediate and profound. The capture of Vimy Ridge eliminated a crucial German observation post that had dominated the surrounding countryside for nearly 3 years. Allied movements behind the lines, previously subject to deadly German artillery fire, could now proceed with relative safety. Psychological effect on German morale was equally significant, as the loss of the impregnable ridge shattered the myth of German defensive invincibility. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, British Commander-in-Chief, recognized the broader implications of the Canadian success. The methodical planning, innovative tactics, and flawless execution demonstrated at Vimy Ridge provided a template for future operations. The creeping barrage technique, the sophisticated coordination between artillery and infantry, and the emphasis on thorough preparation would influence Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. The human cost of victory weighed heavily on the survivors. In the Canadian trenches, now facing east from the crest of the ridge, soldiers wrote letters home describing both the triumph and the terrible price paid for it. Private Harold Baldwin of the 25th Battalion wrote to his family in Nova Scotia, "We have taken the ridge that others could not take, but at such a cost. The boys who fell here died as heroes, and Canada will remember them forever." The German reaction to the loss of Vimy Ridge was one of shock and desperate attempts at justification. General Friedrich von Lossberg, whose Fourth Army had been responsible for the ridge's defense, faced severe criticism from the German High Command. The loss of such a crucial position to what many German officers still considered colonial troops was particularly galling, and led to a fundamental reassessment of British Empire military capabilities, as detailed in the London Times. Extensive coverage. The international press recognized the significance of the Canadian achievement. British newspapers, which had previously viewed Canadian forces as useful, but secondary contributors to the war effort, began to acknowledge the Dominion's emergence as a major military power. French publications, still mourning their own massive losses and failed attempts to take the ridge, praised the Canadian success while questioning their own tactical approaches. The consolidation of the captured positions required enormous effort and resources. Canadian engineers worked around the clock to reverse the German trenches, establish new communication lines, and prepare defensive positions facing east. The captured German equipment was catalogued and either destroyed or turned against its former owners. Hundreds of German prisoners were processed and sent to rear areas, providing valuable intelligence about enemy dispositions and morale. The medical aftermath of the battle tested the Canadian Corps. Evacuation and treatment systems, field hospitals. Behind the lines worked frantically to treat the wounded, while casualty clearing stations processed the steady stream of injured men. The efficiency of the medical system, developed through months of planning and preparation, saved countless lives and demonstrated the same attention to detail that had characterized the entire operation, perhaps most significantly. The victory at Vimy Ridge began to reshape Canadian national identity. News of the triumph reached Canada within days, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. From Halifax to Vancouver, Canadians celebrated not just a military victory, but a coming voyage moment for their young nation. The ridge that had defeated the great European powers had fallen to Canadian arms, and the implications for national pride and international recognition were profound. The political ramifications were equally significant. Prime Minister Robert Borden, who had committed Canada to the war effort despite considerable domestic opposition, found his position strengthened by the victory. The success at Vimy Ridge provided tangible evidence that Canadian sacrifices were producing results and that the Dominion was playing a crucial role in the Allied war effort. The Battle of Vimy Ridge concluded on April 12, 1917, but its impact would reverberate through Canadian history for generations to come. As the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared from the captured positions, it became increasingly apparent that something profound had occurred, not merely a military victory, but the birth of a nation's confidence in its own capabilities and its place in the world. The immediate military consequences extended far beyond the ridge itself. The Canadian Corps, having demonstrated its ability to achieve what seasoned European armies could not, was increasingly called upon for the most challenging assignments. General Arthur Currie, promoted to command the entire Canadian Corps following the battle, would lead his men to further victories at Passchendaele, Amiens, and the final breakthrough of the Hindenburg Line. The tactical innovations developed at Vimy Ridge, the creeping barrage, combined arms coordination, and meticulous preparation became standard practice throughout the Allied forces. The human dimension of the victory was perhaps its most profound aspect. The men who had stormed the ridge carried with them not just Canadian flags, but the hopes and dreams of a young nation. Private William Milne, who had survived the assault on the first day, wrote in his diary, "We came here as boys from farms and factories across Canada. We leave as men who have proven that our nation can stand with any in the world." This transformation from colonial subjects to confident citizens of a sovereign nation was repeated in thousands of individual stories. The memorial that would later be constructed on the ridge captured this transformation perfectly. The towering monument, with its grieving figure of Canada mourning her dead, would become a pilgrimage site for generations of Canadians seeking to understand their national identity. The names of the 11,000 Canadian dead with no known graves carved into the memorial's base represent not just individual sacrifice, but the price paid for national recognition. The political implications of Vimy Ridge extended far beyond military matters. At the Paris Peace Conference following the war, Canada demanded and received separate representation, no longer content to be represented solely by Britain. The confidence gained on the slopes of Vimy Ridge translated into diplomatic assertiveness. That would eventually lead to complete Canadian independence. As documented in the parliamentary debates of the 1920s, Vimy Ridge was repeatedly cited as evidence of Canada's readiness for full sovereignty. The battle also transformed how other nations viewed Canada. The United States, which had initially been skeptical of Canadian military capabilities, began to recognize the Dominion as a significant military power. European allies, who had previously dismissed Canadian forces as well-meaning but amateur, came to respect the professionalism and effectiveness of Canadian arms. Even the Germans, in their post-war analyses, acknowledged the superiority of Canadian tactics and training. The legacy of Vimy Ridge extended into the realm of military education and doctrine. Staff colleges around the world studied the battle as an example of how modern warfare should be conducted. The emphasis on thorough preparation, combined arms coordination, and innovative tactics became standard curriculum in military academies. The ridge itself became a case study in how determination, planning, and execution could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. For the families of the fallen, the victory provided some measure of comfort in their grief. The knowledge that their sons, fathers, and brothers had died in a successful action that achieved its objectives and advanced the cause of freedom helped ease the pain of loss. The Canadian war graves scattered across the ridge became sacred sites where grief and pride intermingled in the national consciousness. The economic impact of the victory was equally significant. The success at Vimy Ridge enhanced Canada's international reputation and contributed to the country's emergence as a major industrial power. The confidence gained on the battlefield translated into commercial success as Canadian. Businesses expanded internationally, and the nation's natural resources found new markets. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Vimy Ridge demonstrated that a young nation, when properly led and prepared, could achieve extraordinary results. The farmers and factory workers who had enlisted in 1914 and 15 had been transformed into one of the most effective military forces in the world. Their victory on the ridge proved that national greatness was not the exclusive province of ancient empires, but could be achieved by any people willing to sacrifice for their ideals. The ridge itself, now peaceful and covered with the carefully tended graves of the fallen, stands as a permanent reminder of what was accomplished. There, the visitor who walks the preserved trenches and tunnels can still sense the magnitude of the achievement. Here in the spring of 1917, Canada announced to the world that it had come of age as a nation. And that announcement was written in the courage and sacrifice of ordinary men who accomplished the extraordinary. The Battle of Vimy Ridge remains, nearly a century later, Canada's defining military memento victory that not only changed the course of the Great War but forged the identity of a nation that would never again be content to stand in the shadows of others.